All right, so without further conversation, I'd like to introduce Henry Halem.
I'd like to thank Mark for inviting me here and seeing this sea of young people that are involved in a field that a few of us started some years ago and we never thought would ever get off the ground. But boy, it's taken off like a jet plane. And it really does my heart good to see so many people worldwide involved in glass. So I'll give you a little bit of my background for those of you that don't know what it is, and there's no reason why you should. Like many of us in the 60s, we started out as potters. My major was ceramics. I have a master's in ceramics. I went out to the University of Wisconsin to do some postgraduate work with Don Wrights out there. And I needed a job. I had no money. I'd left a job. And I ran into this guy named Harvey Littleton, who was a potter. And he was the head of the art department. And I asked him if there was any jobs to be had. And he said, "Do you know anything about glass?" And I said, "Nothing." He said, "Well, that's okay." He said, "No one else does either. I need an assistant." And I had already turned, did my mic just click off? No. I had already turned 30. And this was at a time when Vietnam was really going strong. And so Harvey was very happy to have someone that wasn't in their 20s. And I had just come from the University of Wisconsin where we had been demonstrating there. So I became Harvey's assistant. He lived out on a farm in Verona. And I polished and ground his glass and took his exhibits, drove them all over the country. And from there, telephone rang one day in the office. And I picked it up and they said, "We're looking to hire somebody at Kent State University. Would you post a notice on the bulletin board that there's a job available at Kent State University?" And I said, "No problem," since I was his assistant. Next day I picked up the phone and I called up and I said, "I noticed on the bulletin board there was a job opening at Kent State University." I got the job, and when I started the job, the woman who I had spoken to on the phone I became friendly with, and she said, "How come nobody else called about the job?" I said, "Go figure." I've never told that story before, but I can't get in trouble now since I've been retired so long. So anyway, it's been fun. Also one of the founders of the Glass Art Society, and believe it or not, I started the Glass Olympics back at Kent State back in the early 70s, and we still hold the record for the longest thread pull. We did it on the back of a motorcycle, and the guy would still be going if there wasn't a red light. Anyway, so let's get started. I have a clicker here, and we'll see what we can do. This is going to be basically an overview with lots of photographs. You got to keep me from falling off the stage. The color of that and the color of this is the same, and it's easy to fall off the stage here. So, and I'm old, and I don't see so well down there.
I'll move down front, catch you.
Yeah, catch me. Anyway, that's me in my Beatles hat, 1968, in Vermilion, South Dakota. Blowing glass. Built a furnace one day and blew glass the next. This is one of Michelangelo's early paintings. And this is the one that never made it to the Sistine Chapel. And that's Harvey Littleton. And that's Nick Labino. Okay? Those two guys together are really the ones responsible for the glass movement in the United States. You know who that is? I don't remember who that guy is. That's Marvin Lepofsky, and that is me. Anyway, so let's get started on this and see where we go. So what we're going to start with here is from the factory. The system prior to Harvey coming on the scene was there was a designer and there was an artisan, a craftsman, if you will, who sat at the bench and looked at designs that Tiffany would give him, and he would make Tiffany's work. It is the traditions of glass. So those people, and it's the traditions in the crafts as well, that there was an artist, there was a designer, and there was the artisan, the craftsman. And so those people that criticize Dale for having people make his work really don't know the history of glass. So it's very important to understand that. And there's nothing wrong with designing work and having people make it. It is your work. So this is what factories look like. They were big, hot, dirty affairs. And this guy here, Shorty Finley, worked at Blanco Glass, which is still going. One of the only hand factories still in existence. Fenton Art Glass went out of business a few years ago. But Blanco is still in business. I think the EPA is slowly catching up with them, though. You've all read about the colored glass industry is having problems with chromium and all of those other chemicals that are carcinogens. But anyway, this is what the interior of the factory looked like. And Shorty was a guy we got to know, and he would come up to the different schools and blow glass, and he was a production glass blower. And he would get in front of our furnaces, which were 200-pound furnaces. We had two 200-pound furnaces. And by noon, he had blown both furnaces out, 400 pounds of glass for our Christmas sales. And we always asked Shorty, why do you come up to the schools all the time to do this? He says, the young girls are so nice. He said, have you ever been to Milton, West Virginia? That was Shorty. He was a character. And so this is the inside of the Fenton factory, and they worked in teams. One of the things Harvey didn't really understand was that working in a team was better than working alone. But Harvey always thought, because he had come from the field of being a potter, potters did it by themselves, that glass blowers should do it by themselves. That's the only thing Harvey really got wrong. Eventually, we figured out that he didn't know what he was talking about, and we eventually started learning how to work with each other and run bits and all of that kind of stuff that you guys do. This is what we thought we were going to look like if we got into glass blowing, so we got kind of nervous about that. This is the Tiffany lamp studio here, and this is an old glass factory, and it was the glass factories that brought about the child labor laws, because they always hired these young kids and took them out of school, and that's when child labor laws got written to prevent what they were doing in the glass industry. This is a nice little diorama that they have at the Corning Glass Works, which is a furnace, which is called a bottle furnace, and it's shaped like a bottle, and there are all of these monkey pots, they're called, in a circle around it, and in the middle is a gigantic flame that comes straight up out of the ground and just goes out the flue, out the top of the factory. And it's when gas was really cheap and they just burned it off like crazy. Those factories, of course, are all gone. All the factories in West Virginia, Indiana, and Illinois, Pennsylvania, they're all gone. So now we come up to a very important event, 1962. Get here, 1962, 54 years ago. This guy came back from Europe, and he got a grant. He went to see Otto Whitman at the Toledo Museum of Art, and he said, I want to try to melt and blow glass. And Otto said, okay, we have a garage out back. You can go out there. So Harvey went out back, and in March, he had his first Toledo glass workshop, where a few people showed up. They couldn't melt anything. They were using a giant weed burner at the time. And so they closed it down, and he ran into a guy named Nick Labino. And Nick said, I think I can help you. So without going into any big, long story on what Nick did, Nick introduced him to a glass that he could melt, which I'll show you later. And they had a furnace, and they were able to melt glass. They had melted glass, and Harvey, and this is pretty funny, suddenly realized no one here knows how to blow glass. They never thought that if they got the glass, they were going to have to blow glass. But there was a bunch of people that had signed up for this workshop. And the people that signed up for it thought it was a workshop in torch working. It was called glass blowing at the time, so they signed up for it. And it was this glass blowing thing that Harvey had started. But there was this guy in the audience named Harvey Leafgreen. And Harvey Littleton said, is there anyone here that knows how to blow glass? Harvey Leafgreen raised his hand. He was retired from the Libby Company in Toledo. And what Leafgreen's job was he had to blow all of the new, what do they call it, when they want to see what something looks like, prototypes, thanks. He was a prototype glass blower. So he would blow into the mold and make a prototype, and they'd be able to see what it was about. And he was retired, so he raised his hands, and Harvey Leafgreen was the guy that showed Harvey Littleton how to blow glass. Well, this is the first furnace. This is Nick Labino designed that furnace. And I have to say, every furnace outside of the crucible furnace, every day tank that's in existence today is some variation on Nick Labino's furnace. So in June of 1962, they had a successful workshop. Harvey went back to the University of Wisconsin and built a studio at the University of Wisconsin in 1963. First class they had was, Marvin was in that class, and Dale was in that class. Dale started out actually in the fiber program. And he came over to the glass program and wanted some glass that he could put into a fiber piece that he was making. It's a very interesting story, but anyway. And it was fun working for Harvey. Harvey was kind of a klutzy kind of guy. He always dropped and broke things. I could regale you with an hour and a half of Harvey Littleton stories, but he was very exciting to work with. Harvey didn't want us to blow glass. He wanted us to make art. He said, I don't want you to make jugs and mugs and stuff. But that's all we wanted to make, were something you could drink beer out of. And so he really would get pissed off at us if we were making things with handles on them or pitchers or stuff like that. But that's basically what we did. And in the back of the studio in Madison was Jingles' bar. And Jingles, never knew his real name. We'd go in with our mugs, and he'd let us drink all day out of our mugs if he got to keep the mug. And the mugs hardly held any. We couldn't, blow stuff bigger than this, and it was about that thick. But we got free beer, and he kept that collection of mugs. I don't know where that collection went off to. So now, what kind of glass did we blow? Well, Nick introduced Harvey to this glass called John Mansville 475 marbles. And they were marbles that were made by the Johns Manville Company in one factory, and they would ship them to a factory that spun it into fibers to make glass insulation. All the insulation in your walls, that pink stuff, it's all glass. And it's this kind of glass, JM 475, and they have other designations. And the pink comes from a plastic coating, a pink plastic coating that's on the outside of it, because the glass fiber is so thin that it would devitrify from the moisture in the air. So they coat it with a plastic so that it doesn't devitrify and fall apart in your wall. That's why it's pink, or whatever color they make it, but it's coated. Okay? There's Harvey for the camera. He was always a show-off. Who blows glass like that? Harvey did. There was, the day we shot this, there was a movie crew in there. So Harvey would do that, and he really was a poser, I got to say. He really, you know, take a look at the burner. Take a look at that. Pretty hairy. We didn't know how to spell the word safety. Didn't exist. Here's Harvey's early work. This is the kind of stuff that Harvey made. It was all made with this. And this is a kind of a borosilicate glass. If you know anything about glass, it was stiff as hell. But we were young and we could run real fast. Okay, this is what the studios looked like. This is one of the early Penland studios. We blew glass in. You know, when you go to when I used to teach here, you'd go there and you'd think you'd died and gone to heaven. I mean, this was incredible. But the glass, the marbles you blew, you couldn't see the bottom of the furnace. I mean, it was green and blue, and it was just cordy, and but it was glass, and we didn't know any better. Out at Pilchuck, they got started pretty much around the same time that Penland got started. And I'm not going to go into the history of Pilchuck, only to show you what the first furnaces looked like and what the first burner systems looked like. All propane. Penland and Pilchuck, it was all propane. We didn't really know much about anything at that time. This is what early furnaces looked like. I mean, this is the kind of stuff. This was, I hate to admit it, but this was one of my furnaces at Kent. And this was after a long campaign. We didn't have crucible furnaces at that time. Everything was a day tank, 200 pounds on up. It wasn't until years later that the crucible was developed and people came along and started building equipment, which we'll get into. But this is what the Penland furnace, I mean, it was a rubble furnace. This was a door, a triple hinge door that was designed by Nick Labino. You could pull it out and just kind of move it off to the side. It was a pretty interesting door. And this is where we heated up gathering rods, just carved a little hole out. It was also, as I said before, the glory hole. All right, so now we're moving right along. Gas 1 and 2. Gas 1 and 2 was held at Penland, 1970-71. 10, 11 of us, 12 of us maybe at the most got together. And the reason we started gas was because none of us knew how to really blow glass. Some guy somewhere knew a little bit of one thing, another guy, Audrey knew something. Where she was in Wisconsin, she would show up. Sylvia would show up with a paperweight technique. Fritz, of course, was the technique man, and he would show up and teach us. So we started the Glass Art Society, which originally started out just for teachers. And after Gas 2, we had a meeting and said, you know, we can't just go on like this. We're getting more and more students now. We got to open this up. So that's, in Gas 3, we opened it up. And I organized Gas 3, went to the Fenton factory and went to see Frank Fenton. Frank Fenton was about 6'6", and I'm like 5'6 and a half. And this big guy, we wanted to go to the factory. And I lived, you know, just down the road here. So I drove down to Williamstown, West Virginia to the factory, and I saw Frank, and I had slides. Mark Pizer. Our work had started to get pretty sophisticated, and Frank Fenton didn't know what was going on. Took me into a room and set up a slide carousel and started showing slides. And he was very skeptical. When I first went in there, this little guy in there, you know, I'm Frank Fenton with the Fenton factory, I'm, you know, big guy. And he saw these slides of Tiffany style stuff and all of this really nifty stuff that he didn't know existed. Lights went up, and he said, when would you like to come here for your meeting? And I said, there's one catch. We want to blow glass on the floor of the Fenton factory. And he said, oh, you can't do that. It's a union shop. And we said, well, we got to do it. He said, I got an idea. Can you come over Memorial Day when it's a holiday? I said, hell yeah. So we went down there. It was Memorial Day. The factory was closed. The workers were gone. We piled in. It was a bunch of people. I organized it. I got the rooms for the people. I got the roommates together. It was a job. We got speakers. We had the meeting. We blew glass on the floor of the Fenton factory, and they had compatible glasses. They had colors you could mix together. They had blue on white. They had opaque colors. We running around this factory. We had died and gone to heaven. Well, it was so exciting. Frank Fenton invited us back a second year. The interesting thing is the second year, the workers had showed up when we were blowing glass there. They didn't know. They thought they were the only ones that could blow glass. They had never seen punty work. They didn't know what a punty was. It was all crimps. Everything they made was with a crimp, an asbestos-coated crimp, and would grab the bottom of something. And they saw us doing punty work, and they spent a whole year teaching themselves how to blow glass so that they could come and compete with us. The second year we went to Fenton. Second Fenton meeting was really exciting. And this was us on the way home from the Fenton factory. That's the kind of stuff they made you see along the road. They went out of business because they never really hired designers. It was all family owned, and they thought they could keep making everything they had made historically, and the world had moved beyond them, and they all went under. And I got a long story about that when one of the factories hired me to do some work for them. But anyway, here's the Asilomar conference, and this is the board. You can see we were having a lousy time then, right? Anyway, I got my Kent State. I noticed my boys and girls from Kent State are here. Yay, let's hear it. Kent State. All right. They paid me to say that. Okay, Davin, you owe me a bag of plaster. Okay. And that's us from the gas 4 sitting there. Anyway, let's move on here. I have a little video here I made, which you'll see. It's a short video, but it'll give you an idea. It's kind of dark and shaky and jumpy, and it's all those things that we were in Gas 2. And I made this with a Super 8 camera, and I finally got it transferred onto a DVD, and I decided, what the hell, I'll show it here. And you'll get the idea of what went on in the early. Got to wake up there. Okay. Turn your cell phones off. This was at Penland. This is 1971 or 2. That's Tom Kekik. He died tragically years ago. He used to teach at RIT. He was the first class teacher there. This is the Penland studio. You can see, I mean, it's dark. Some of this is pretty good. But you can see sort of what it, kind of black here too. For one of the first pot furnaces that we had, counterweight in the back of it. This was at Mark Peiser's studio down at Penland. That's Bob Barber. I won't go in. He was very important. He was a technical guy. He was a lamp worker, and he was one of my classmates. And he knew how to make color in glass. He got oxides, and we took the marbles, and we made blue glass, and he actually made this liver red glass. He knew about reduction and all of this stuff. So we made colors out of color. This is Dick Huss showing us how to make silver nitrate into special things to put silver on the surface of our glass, which no one really does anymore because we found out we were killing ourselves with it. It's a wonder some of us are still alive with the asbestos and the silver and the fuming materials and so on. The tin chloride, the fumes in the studio. This is just a view of Penland at that time. That's Jan Zandwies. and Billy Bernstein. That's Mr. Bernstein's father. That's one of the first Penland studios. That's what our studios look like. That's Tom McLaughlin. He passed away a few years ago. Really missed. He's one of the earliest guys in glass. Whoa. It gets better after this. There's that furnace. These are our annealing ovens. That was the size of our annealing ovens. All right, there's Marvin Lipovsky. He passed away a little over a year ago. And this is the group. It's Tom McLaughlin, Fritz Streisbach, Billy Bernstein. There's Marvin. He was an irascible son of a bitch, but he's missed. I don't know if you ever had a run-in with... I'm sorry you're recording this, but I've called it to his face. I mean, there were times I didn't talk to this guy for 2 years. That's Fritz fooling around with a couple of burner tips. That's Jack Schmidt. There's Jack. You guys in Toledo, you never saw that, huh? Jack was always a really good glass blower right from the beginning. He really has great hands. There's Jack at the bench. We were making this crazy. There's a there's a bit. This was a real group effort. These were the students at Penland. They came out to see what the hell was going on. And then the goblet top. And Jack's blowing on it. We didn't have air at that time. And then we try to get it off. That end.
What is that tool?
That's a modern tool. It's called a file. And then it hit the floor. When they hit the floor. After this, there's a nice lip wrap. And I was just loading new film when it hit the floor, so I missed that. This is Dave Jacobs. Dave Jacobs started the Paoli Clay Company. Harvey Littleton put him in business with the Paoli Clay Company, and he was the first person that had tools There was a guy named Tenzing who made diamond shears. They may still be around somewhere, but they were these gigantic shears that really didn't cut much, but it was all we had. And he had these tools, as Bill Boyson, Bob held in Canada. And he sold us tools, and it was great, but sorry about that. What can I tell you? It's Fritz. If you see Fritz, you get on him for that. There's Mark Pizer, very important figure in the history of glass. Very important. But in any event, Dave Jacobs would bring a giant wheel of Wisconsin cheese. Jim Tanner, he was from Mankato. He was from ceramics also, and he went back into ceramics. He still teaches up there in Mankato, I believe. There's Marvin. Obviously, we were having a lot of fun. We didn't drink as much beer as all of these people kept saying. We just sat around drinking beer. We really taught each other how to do different things, which are crude by today's standards, but it gave us a chance to go back to our studios and show our students the latest and greatest, whatever it was, how to drop a foot and how to use a footing tool made out of wood. There's Bob Bobber. So we'll move along here. This is the end of it. And after that, the thing that then, after gas, we then had workshops. That's where information really started getting imparted to us, was through the workshops. No money ever changed hands. It was always, the students would cook something, or we'd get pizza and we'd come to the studio at night. But during the day, we would show the techniques that we knew, and I would go out to Joel Meyer's place, and I would show them how to do casting. I started casting in 1970, 71 after the shootings at Kent State. And I would demonstrate how to make molds for casting. Joel would come, and he had been to Scandinavia. He taught us how to do steam bubbles. Marvin would come and didn't really show us much of anything. And Fritz would come, and he would show us some mold blowing. He would make molds out of different kinds of pieces of metal and blow into screens and all of this stuff, which I really liked and to do. I thought mold blowing was great. What did I do? I got to go back. I hit the wrong button here. Am I going back? Yeah, let me go forward now. That's me in Vermilion, South Dakota. Okay, anyway, so we did the workshops, and then suddenly there was a show in Florida at the Loeb Museum, and all of this crazy work showed up, and they did this newspaper article that came out. And, oh, shit, I hate these things. It's supposed to reverse. Okay, got it.
Where is that piece?
This piece is at the Corning Museum. That got me tenure. After the shootings, I made a whole series of works, and I figured out how to cast glass. It was no mean trick. Luckily, I had come from a background where I had studied bronze casting, so I knew about how to make refractory molds. And I had a feeling that a bronze casting mold could withstand elevated temperatures, 1,500 degrees. So the formula that I used was 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, which was a standard formula for making bronze casting molds. 1/3 fire clay, 1/3 plaster, 1/3 silica. You'd mix that up, you'd invest your wax, burn it out, and you'd cast it. Well, what happened was the first castings I did in a mold like that, the clay in the mold stuck to the glass. So I figured out, get rid of the clay. I knew what was going on because glass basically has an affinity for silica. And so the second experiments I did were 50 plaster, 50 silica, made the molds, and then sculpted out of clay, and then poured the mold material over the clay, pulled the clay out, cleaned the mold, put glass in it, made that, had that at the second Toledo Glass National. The guy that was the curator of contemporary glass at Corning saw it and came to me and said, we'd like to buy it. And they had just started collecting glass. Harvey's was the first piece of glass they had bought, 2 pieces of his, 2 white figures that he had sculpted and cast in glass. And this was the second one they bought. And I sold it to them for a huge price of $400. It's very thrilling to go back to the Corning Museum and walk through the museum and see your work sitting there. As sophisticated as you might become, when you get your work in collections, it's very humbling to see it in a major collection, and it's very thrilling. I once went up to a guy that was taking a picture of it, and I said, I made that. And the guy looked at me and he said, bullshit. I took out my wallet, right? I took him over and I showed him my driver's license. And he went, whoa, would you stand by it? Sorry about the bullshit. Anyway, so they had this show, and we were on our way. We were on our way. Studios. Students started to go out into the world. There were no teaching jobs to have. They wanted to build studios. They needed information on building studios. Where the hell was this information going to come from? Fritz and Dudley. Dudley produced really the first, I don't have the cover of the first edition from '77, but this is more or less what it looked like. And it was all handwritten and printed, and he would sell supplies. You could buy his Gibson ceramic burner head, which he developed, and other companies have taken it and run with that burner head, but it's still a very common burner head that's used. And this kind of burner with needle valves, we'll get into other burners soon. And so we had his to look at, to how to build annealing ovens, how to figure electricity. And then Fritz came out with this before we were really on our way as gas for the NCECA and SECA. We were part of a ceramic organization originally before we became the Glass Art Society. And so he came out with this booklet, which, by the way, if you go to my website, glassnotes.com, you can download this booklet. I scanned the whole thing, and with his permission, it's online. And you can download it and see and read, when you print it out, exactly what was going on at this period of time. It's a really good historical document. So if you go to there, you can do that. And so they were very instrumental in helping us, and helping me especially because Fritz was in Toledo building the first Toledo studio. So I used to go there, and he used to teach me how to wind elements and do all of that kind of stuff. And this is the kind of equipment, we're almost at the end here, this is the kind of equipment we had it through the years in that time. And this is my first furnace that I built in Vermilion, South Dakota. That's me with a mustache back there. And that's a Venturi burner that went to a big propane tank out back. Built it, got there in the evening, we built it through the night, turned it on, kids slept in a sleeping bag, no safety equipment, slept there. Next day, we blew glass. It was great. I developed this rollout oven where you could put stuff in there and roll it out and pick it up. First kind of rollout oven, kind of crude, but it worked. It was great. This is some weird looking pot furnace. This was one of our annealing ovens, and we'll get to controllers in a minute. But this is the controller. I mean, these things, they work pretty good. All right. The evolution of the controller was a very important aspect of the studio. Without the evolution of the controller, we'd still be more or less in the Dark Ages, because to anneal a thick piece of glass, all we had was a range control. 10 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, low and high. And so for me to do my castings, and I was the first one to do the castings, and Nick taught me about annealing, which I won't go into, but I had to sleep in the studio, and every 15 minutes get up because the oven would run away with itself. Even if you had it on 1, temperature would keep climbing. Because all the elements did would go on and off. That's all they did. There was no zone or range controls on them. So the element would go on for a period of time. That's how your stove works. An electric stove, it goes on, it goes off. And so that's what we had. This is the pyrometer with the thermocouple. I got that at Army Surplus down in Columbus. Went down there and picked that up. And so I kept having to turn it down and eventually got the castings to work. Well, Nick came along and he developed this thing, and he taught us about this thing called a variable auto transformer, or a variac, made by a few companies. And that's something, you turn a dial on it, and it not only changes the voltage, but it also varies the amperage, so that then you could really vary the amount of power going into your elements. So it was no longer on and off, but it would, you know how when it's glowing really hot and the surface is really hot? Well, with a variac, you can turn it down and get it to just barely glow, and different ranges in between. So what Nick developed, he took a chicken timer that you got from Granger, put a wooden wheel on it, put a string, attach the string to it. So here there's a chicken timer here. It's a little box. You can still get them. They're for turning lights on and off in chicken houses. And they got tremendous torque to them because they go through a lot of gears. And so you take this line and you'd wind it around there, and you'd wind it around the variac. And as the chicken timer had a clock in it, as the chicken timer turned, it would pull the string and it would lower the variac. So the temperature would slowly fall. It was brilliant. But half the time, it would get caught up, and the torque was so great on it, it would just snap the string. So you'd come back and it would be stuck at like 980. All night it would be sitting there at 980 or whatever. But Fritz drew it up. You can see the wood wheel. There's the variac. So if you want to build these, there's the plans. I recommend you do it if you want to go back in time. And this was the ultimate. This is the first GB. I'm just kidding, but this did 1, 2, 3, 4. This did 4 different annealing ovens at the same time. Fritz built that. It's still in Piser's studio down in Penland if you ever go down there. So we started with, this is what the knobs look like. This is the complex wiring for that device. This was a breakthrough. This is 1976. Pam Vandiver and her husband, Kim Vandiver, worked at MIT, and he was a brilliant guy. And he developed this machine, which I just got in the mail. One of my former students had one, and I advertised that. I'm starting a museum of controllers so that people can see what we went through. And this was the first real controller. You could dial things and it would do it automatically through these little SCR things or whatever the hell was in there. He sold a lot of them. Then Ron Shapiro came along and Richard Tenney, and they started a company called the Digitree Company. And as far as I'm concerned, I think what they did is still the state of the art. It is simple, straightforward. You just dial it in. I know they have new stuff now from pads and things, which to me are just the biggest pain in the ass because you can't really teach it. And when someone wants a studio, one-person studio, I say, go get a GB1. He didn't pay me to say that. But what do I know? I'm old. You guys know more than I do. After that, we then needed glass to blow. So we jumped back in time, and there was this company, Joel Myers and I discovered back in the early 70s, called the Gabbert Cullet Company. They were down right next to the Fenton factory. And I had this little book, and the little book listed all the glass factories in the United States and all the cullet companies. And I looked it up and I found this Gabbert Cullet Company, and I called up this guy, O.J. Gabbert. And now O.J. Gabbert talked like this. He had been in World War II, and his vocal cords had frozen, he said, when he was flying planes, and his voice had this raspy, deep voice, real character. And I said, do you have cullet glass? He said, I got every kind of cullet you'd ever want. So Joel and I asked him if he had a cullet from the Fenton factory. We had seen their crystal, it's beautiful crystal. He said, how many tons do you want? I said, tons? I said, can I get 2 barrels? So we went down, I got 2 barrels of Fenton crystal, and it was like we had died and gone to heaven. We were blowing marbles, we put this cullet in the furnace, and it was soft, and we were still used to running around, but now the glass is kind of dripping on the floor because it's a lot softer. So we had to get used to this. And then I called him, I said, do you have any colors that fit the glass? And he said, how many you want? You know, he said, I don't know anything about that, but I had known from the Fenton trip that there were colors that fit. So we got the white glass, and we got black glass, we got blue glass, we got orange glass, we got red glass, and some of them fit. Well, that went on for years. I won't bore you with it. Harvey started the Spruce Pine Batch Company. Harvey had his fingers in everything that made money. And Harvey started the Spruce Pine Batch Company and then put his son Tom in charge of it. And then, as you know, these nuggets and all the other glass, which I don't know anything that's going on with this now, you guys know. And one of the companies, Spectrum, they're going under or something, or they're now redoing it or something like that, I was told. So all the pieces and parts now had come together. The studio was born. And so we went from that Labino style furnace, Labino Toledo burner style, to this. And this now is what you can buy off the shelf. Very few, if anybody, really builds their own equipment anymore. And I know this because the book I had written, Glass Notes, sold close to 20,000 copies of that book. But in the last few years, the sale of it has really diminished, and it's because nobody's really building furnaces anymore. No one's batching glass anymore. And my book it deals with the building of furnaces, garages, pipe warmers, and all of this stuff. But now everybody calls up Wet Dog or Hub and so on and spends a lot of money buying this stuff. And so this is the kind of stuff, you know, we used to build this stuff. We got pretty sophisticated with building stuff, and that's how these guys got into doing this. I really love this for this Bell type oven. There's really, you can do some interesting kinds of work with this. It really puts a very high lid on what you're doing. It's really good for casting, flower pot casting. Really good for that. And then, of course, recuperation to save energy. People started writing books. If you really want to make money, that's the business you go in. That's where the money is, okay? Shouldn't be sitting here doing this junk. Get out there and start making pipes and bongs. But anyway, people, I forgot they're recording this. This was the first book that came out. Frank Kulashewicz wrote this book. And it was, you could build stuff from it. It was kind of Labino furnace. And no safety, anything in it. And it was a fairly popular book. When I was a kid, this was before my time, but when I was a kid, we had this kind of thing, and every kid that had one of these burned his hands. You'd get on your stove, and you'd take these tubes, and you'd go with a tube, and then you'd grab it and fry your fingers on it. Mother would get real angry with you. And this was, of course, the book I wrote. Albin Elskis wrote a book on painting on glass for glass stainers. It's still the book to have if you're going into staining glass. Wonderful, great guy he was. So there's all kinds of books now, you know, fusing and so on. Went from studios like this to today's studios. If any of you have ever been to the Pittsburgh, if you haven't been to Pittsburgh, take a trip down to the Pittsburgh Glass Center. It's the bomb. Isn't that right? The bomb, is that right? So that's a good comparison. You can see where we've come from. And this is studios from all over the world. Africa, Asia, that's Pittsburgh. Yeah, that's Pittsburgh. That's, I don't know where that is. Detroit. That's Detroit? I don't know. That's, of course, out where Chihuly is. That's in Tacoma. That's the studio in Tacoma. I don't know where that is either. I just pulled these off the internet. And so we get to the end and we pay homage. These are the shoulders you're standing on. This gentleman here, he was wondrous to know. I'm glad I knew him intimately, worked for him, ground and polished his pieces. I ground and polished that. And I think I did that one too, or something. He broke that one. Oh, I could tell you stories. He was a character. And you really need, if it wasn't for this guy, God knows where we would be. Harvey was not technologically inclined. He never would have figured it out. And so the serendipity of Nick being there when this Toledo workshop came about was just extraordinary. It was like that first picture I showed you. And Nick's work, Nick did a lot of these castings. He did some incredible stuff. And I don't think he really gets the due that he should. He should really be revered more than he is. And I'll just tell you one Nick story. Nick was never a teacher. And when I was trying to figure out annealing for my castings, I had everything backwards. And I called Nick up. And he lived in Ohio in Maumee, right outside of Toledo. And I said, Nick, I'm doing these castings. And Nick was very secretive about what he did. He said, I don't teach and I don't tell anybody how to do things. But he said, you're doing castings, huh? He said, what do you know, kid? He said, bring your castings out. And I had a nice big casting, sculpted, realist casting I brought out to him. It was in 2 pieces. He looked at it and he said, wow, you've done your homework. That's really nice. Come into my office. And he sat me down and spent maybe 3-4 hours explaining the ins and outs of annealing. And it was one of the most wonderful days I ever spent with him. He also developed the tiles that went on the space shuttle. Not many people know that. And I was out there one day, and Wally Schirra was out there with the guys from NASA, and I was out there. And he had this little room where he developed all of this stuff. And Wally Schirra was in front of me, and the guy from NASA, and Nick was here, and we started walking to his room. And the guy from NASA turns around and he says, do you have clearance to see this? Clearance? I can't even spell clearance. And he said, well, you can't go in there. So they went in there, and they looked at the tiles that Nick was working on. And they got in their cars and left, and Nick comes out and he says, "Come here, I want to show you this." He was very proud of what he did. He said, "You don't need clearance with me." Went into and he showed me these tiles that he had been working on. And he said, "They're going in the wrong direction with it, but what the hell, they're paying me a lot of money for this." And he said, "You know how they're putting them onto the space shuttle?" And this is before they even had the first shot. I said, "No," he says, "they're siliconing them on." He said, "They're taking a special silicone and just sticking them on." He says, "I don't know, you know." And that was quite an adventure. But anyway, that basically is all there is. There ain't no more. It's all in your hands now. And I'm glad to see you're having fun, and I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That was awesome.
Thank you.